How's that for font size? Good. I'm normally terrible with font size. You can see that I like things really small. So today this is the last of 3 introductory classes. Next week we're going to get into more. Well, I mean, actually, next week will still be relatively introductory. We're going to be doing bivariate analysis. But these first 3 weeks, what we've been doing is making sure you've got R installed and also just introducing the course in week 1. Week 2, we did an introduction to research methods where we have a refresher on research methods, talking about issues of measurement and validity and so forth. And then this week, we're doing a bit of a refresher course in statistics. It is by necessity brief. One of the things I've done here, is that I tried to integrate this with what you've already been taught. So I went and did your whole course last week. I sat down and read through all slides and so all his guides and so forth. And with that, trying to change my material from last year so it's more in line with what you've learned before, and so it's more sort of consistent and so forth. Because the reality is with something like statistics and with R and so forth, everyone has a slightly different take on it, especially when you're doing programming in R. And what Young has done, which I think is great, is he's picked about 5 packages to run almost all this stuff through. There are like 20,000 packages out there. I've used lots of other different ones. What I'm trying to do is use them consistently with the ones that he's been using. And I think he's made the right decisions around those. So, anyway, what I'm going to do today is basically briefly go through an introduction to statistics. I'm going to talk about it mostly from the perspective as a social scientist. I think one of the things to remember is as you need to understand broadly how it works, and also know when someone's basically bullshitting you and not, when they're statistician telling you need to spend lots of money on, or use this incredibly complex measure that's not actually going to produce much results. But you are not going to be someone who can do linear algebra. And just to give you a sense, you need linear algebra to calculate the simplest multiple linear regression. I was looking at the derivation last night, looking through, could I teach this? And I was like, no, there is absolutely no way I'm going to be teaching. And that's one of the things I think it's worth understanding. You've got to get the basics. You've got to have enough understanding so no one can cheat you, and then you need to know how to apply it well and apply it so that you can know whether to make decisions, to be able to to develop theories about the world, to test them, and so forth. And so I think it's worth just remembering that there is a distinction between what we do in this course and what we do in, say, a statistics course. Yep. And you've got to at some level ride with that a little bit and understand that some of your understanding is by necessity going to be by analogy. Yeah. Or on the basis of, well, it was published in lots of journals and lots of other people have done it, so it seems pretty reasonable. And I broadly understand the principles of it, so that's fine. But today what we're going to do is I'm going to the rule is I'm supposed to only have 8 concepts. So there's your 8 concepts. Apparently you can only remember 8 in one class. But most of those you should be more or less familiar with. Things like means and medians and minimums and maximums and percentiles. I know that as we head down towards here, we're going to start to come to some that will be fuzzy for some and not so fuzzy for others. And that's where I'm going to try and concentrate. As I've said over the past few weeks, the idea here is to really build your foundations, right? Because the most important thing, so I don't know what, Young's going to come in, I think, week 7 when we've got your presentations, and in week 13, and he'll be sitting there going, they've had 10 minutes, do they really know what they're talking about or not? And what I want you to do is, I know, having seen lots of students go through this process over the last 10 years, getting the fundamentals is the core to actually being able to stand up there and know what you're talking about. So don't get too, yeah. So this stuff is important. So I've got a sort of an out. We're on the outline, and what we're going to do for the first lecture that I'm about to give is go through various introductions to statistics. Though I think the easier way to think about it is to think about these questions that I've posed. So, what's the difference? If you can answer these, you're sort of really well on your way. So, what's the difference between deductive and inferential statistics? How can I meaningfully describe a large data set with just actually two numbers? Right? How can I use a small sample of the real world to draw conclusions about the larger world we can't see? How do I express certainty and uncertainty in my measurements? How can I express the strength of a relationship between two variables? And how do I know to find strength? Where do I look for that as I do different tests? And how do I know which sort of statistical tests to use? Some of these, towards the end, we're going to keep coming back to and you'll learn more about. But for me, these are sort of the underlying fundamental things that drive us all to be wanting to be able to learn a course like this. We're going to do an exercise. Basically, what I've done is I've given two articles. One of them is the first time I've done it. It's actually a data set from my own PhD, but it's a published article from it. But there's also the one we used last week, so you don't have to make any reference to me. But I think I've got two data sets. The first one is the one we did last week, which was on youth participation in politics and how the internet has affected that based on the Australian Electoral Survey or Australian Electoral Study. So you'll be able to identify some of these concepts in that. And then the second one is my PhD was on political donations by corporations and how those and lots of other different social factors like what school you went to or what clubs you're members of or how you were linked to government companies and so forth affected sort of political donation strategies that companies made. So they'll be there. We're going to then do some very basic, not basic, these are not basic, these are just really unbelievably powerful and handy R commands and make sure we're on top of these. We're going to make sure you've got an understanding of piping, and then we're going to go through and basically work out how to get the summary statistics, which is what we're trying to do this week. And we end with a sort of practical exercise where you can do that if we have time. So at this stage, is there anything on your mind? Because we should get things off your mind. Who's anxious about the presentation in week 7?
I have a question.
Yes.
So is the topic that you do for week 7?
Ideally, it should be the same as 13, yes.
Oh, it's the same.
Yes, it's basically the difference is that week 7 doesn't have to include the multivariate statistics and doesn't necessarily have to involve doing graphs and so forth and bivariate graphs. But because you haven't been here, so let me just say some things that I've said to everyone else. You're always welcome to go further than what this asks. So if you think that this looks too easy, sure, do one in week 1, week 7, do another one in week 13 and present the multivariate analysis in the first pass and replicate something else in week 13. I'm fine with that, right? You can also not only replicate it, you can go a bit further. You're going to have a data set with lots of variables. Maybe you're going to find something really interesting. There's some interaction effects or look at some different dependent variables. But the first task is to replicate those 3 tables, right, which is univariate, so like minimum, maximum, mean, standard deviation, number of valid cases. Then bivariate, so basically a correlation matrix, and then to do some linear regression models or logistic regression or whatever. If the papers that you have found end up using more complex regression, you're welcome to. We can look up those commands with you and we can run them, or we can also use the ones we've already done, like linear regression or a logistic regression or so forth. So I'm happy to. Yeah, does that answer some of your questions? I know that's right. I went way further than that. Okay. Other questions? I was thinking in terms of next week, one of the things, because I mean, we're a small group, I can tailor these things. I was thinking that maybe for next week, what I could do is try to get together model commands to do the main to do the main types of stuff you're going to need to do. Like I might do a mock version of it, so that then you can take those and apply them. You get what I mean? Because it's like Young in his teaching for you last year went through lots and lots and lots of different things, but it's often about how do I really combine this to get it to all sort of work together. I think what we could do next week is I could just focus on the R commands and going through and saying, okay, how do we go through cleaning up a data set? How do we go through generating the univariate decisions? How do we go through and make a nice correlation table? Does that sound good? Okay, all right. So that's what I think I'll focus next. This week's supposed to be on bivariate, but I think that's pretty close to what we'll do anyway. Yeah. Okay. Very good. That makes my life clear as well. Okay. So, are there any other comments or questions? Is the pace okay so far? Okay, so I'm going to try and stand in front of this as much as I can because I feel sorry for the people at home. Oh God, am I on the wrong page? I'm now on the wrong page. I apologize. Okay, so intro to stats. There is a nice summary here which I am not going to go through, but you're welcome to have a read through it. Let me start with the first. What I've tried to do here, partly just to make it interesting, but I think one of the amazing things that I've learned about learning as I've taught more is that one of the best ways you can make sure you really know, there's a few things you can do if you want to know, do I know that concept, right? Like regression. Do you know that concept? I don't know, right? Now, there are a few different things. One is give an example. Talk me through a real practical example of it. But another one that you can do, which is even simpler, is describe it to me in one word. Or describe it to yourself in one word. And then describe it to yourself in one phrase. And so one of the things I've done here with this is I've tried to capture the essence of each topic with a little subtitle. Maybe they're a bit corny sometimes. I think they definitely are because corny can be memorable. But and so what I want to do is I want to just point that out, and I don't do that to be corny. I do that because if you can distill something down to its essence, you've made it memorable and your life a lot easier for yourself. You know, because that is a foundation you can build on. You can't build on an incredibly complex thing you don't understand. So, descriptive statistics. I call it two numbers that are as good as a million. And the point here is that descriptive statistics really are about something you can see. You've got the whole data set. You can look at it. If you wanted to, you can trawl through the phone book. You can go through the Australian census, in theory, and look at every single person. I can go through all the people in this room and get your individual ages or your individual, I don't know, number of children or number of brothers and sisters or how many coffee you had today or whatever, right? Now, I could have that list of numbers, but actually, if I had it up on the board and we looked at it, we'd all go, we'd sort of be trying to size it up, and it'd be, even just for 10 people, it would be, or 11 if you include me, it'd be kind of difficult, let alone for 22 million people, right? And so descriptive statistics, their primary purpose is to allow us to actually abstract and simplify a huge amount of data to two main numbers. And those two main numbers are a central tendency, normally the mean, but it can also be the median or the mode, and the other one is some sort of indicator of variation, right? So how dispersed is that set? Is it everyone all around the same number? Are we all drinking the same number of coffees every day? We vary between 0 and 10. I don't know. The other thing to note about descriptive statistics is, and we're going to come to this a little bit later, but I'll say it now to place it in your mind, is what's the difference between that and inferential statistics? And inferential statistics, the idea is that actually for almost everything, possibly government census data, right? And maybe elections as well, right? Because that's a real, actual census. We can't actually find out information about the real world that we're concerned about. It's just too expensive. It's it's too expensive, and it's normally not even possible even if we had almost infinite amounts of money, right? And so what we do in that case is we need some way to draw conclusions about it, about this infinite world. And the way we do it is we grab a very small sample of the world, we look at it, and then we work out from that what can I say about the rest of the world. And that's the essence of inferential statistics. I give a cute example here of a descriptive statistic. I looked it up. It is that, what is it? The median. I got median because income is skewed distribution. Do you know how skewed distribution is, income is? If the average height of a person was there, no. If the average income, I think this is in America. If the average income in America was transformed into height, the tallest person in the world, the richest person in the world would be how tall? It's about 200 kilometers. Right? That's a gift. If you want to explain distribution to someone, say there are no humans 200 kilometers tall. A normal distribution, they get to 7 foot, maybe 8 foot, right? Anyway, so it's a skewed distribution, and we can see here the median is about $600 a week. Okay, so I won't dwell on these because I think you really know them, but if you want to revise them, I've tried to take a bit of time on it. The central tendency is basically the idea of one number to represent them all, right? Well, I think like the Lord of the Rings, one ring to rule them all. It's like one number represents them all. And mean is fine if you've got a nice normal distribution. Median is often necessary, like with income, where you have some people who are 250 kilometers high, and you don't want them biasing the data set. Actually, I mean, we know just to say, that this last election that was sort of used for statistics to lie. I think the Liberal Party gave $200 million in tax cuts, and they always kept quoting how much of that went to average or above average people. But actually, average for income is a real misleading. Average in Australia is about 80,000, but median is about 60,000. So I think half the tax cuts went to the above average, but it was a lot fewer that went to lower income people. We can use mode. We use median for skewed data, and we use mode for data sets that are not ordered, so categorical or ordinal. We can't talk about the median color, right? It just doesn't make any sense, but we can talk about the most common color in this room that people are wearing, blue or black, right? Okay. The other thing we want to do is, we all know, and we will be reminded by all of our qualitative researchers, that there's an incredible amount of variation in the world, even within a data set, a single variable. And so how do we capture that? The main way it's captured is standard deviation, which you all would have heard a lot about. I've done a little box down here on standard deviation and tried to explain it in everyday language. I don't really... I think that the main thing to note about it is that because there are these squares and these square roots, everyone just assumes I can't make intelligent meaning out of it. I just give it to a computer to do. Right? Am I right? Am I brutally right? Okay. But what I want to say is that you can kind of abstract out those things if you think it through. And what you will get to is what you will get to is it's something I think slightly more. I don't think it's perfect, but I just want to talk it through briefly with you. I think that the way I understand standard deviation, if I have to think about it, it's about basically the average distance that any particular variable is, right? And the squaring is to squaring partly is to get rid of negative numbers, and partly it is to punish big deviances. So if there's lots of variables way out, that actually makes bigger numbers, and it should be punished more, and there's more variation. But the square root in large part is partially meant to compensate for that. I don't think I'm completely right. I'm not completely right about that, but I think that in some ways, for you to have that as a rough, intuitive understanding, is probably a good thing, if I could put it that way, yeah? But because I think that it is definitely trying to break these mathematics. Like I know in sociology and social sciences and public policy, there's a lot of fear. We're the people who didn't go and do the science degree, and then we didn't go and do the psychology major, right? And so there can be a lot of fear around maths. I think just trying to work out ways to break it down, which I've tried to do here, and you can read in more detail, can make it a little bit less intimidating and also give you a more meaningful sense of the number. Okay, so standard deviation, broadly speaking, it's a measure of how far the average person deviates from the mean. The problem is that this doesn't work really well when we have skewed data again. And so often then things like an interquartile range, which is simply the distance between the bottom 25 and the top 75%, is another number that can be used. And this is why you often see box plots used in public policy documents. The box plot will plot this visually for people. The other descriptive statistics we do are minimums and maximums, and you're like, man, I reckon you could have done this in primary school. Why do you even need to talk to us about minimum and maximum? But what I want to tell you is actually, I love to see, when I see it in an academic paper, if someone doesn't show me their descriptive statistics, that are the minimum and maximum, I'm always a little bit suspicious. And the reason is when I look at my minimum and maximum, half the time I find problems, right? I'm sure if you looked at, like, what was the problem with your minimum and maximum in your data sets? Maximums. There were 9 and 99. Because in his data set, which is the Korean social survey, in Jack's data set, you explain.
Yeah, all is from those 94 of age.
Yeah, but also they have recoded all the missing values as 999 and 9 and so forth, right? So that can immediately throw you off. That can immediately reveal things. And so I would say to you, these minimum maximum allows you to identify areas, and it also allows you to identify skewness, right? Because if you see a data set where the median is 80,000, but the maximum is, 50 billion, then it's very different to a median of 80,000 and a maximum of 160,000 or something. So they're important. We can't even use those. No, we can use those. We often use percentiles for various categories when we have categorical data. The last thing that we often really like to look at is simply how much missing data there is. It turns out that this varies a lot by question, particularly for sensitive data, which often turns out to be the stuff that's interesting and people therefore write papers about. Just reporting the number of missing cases for each variable makes a big difference, and it's pretty standard. And also sometimes it reveals that there's recoding to do. So again, in Jack's data, he's got it on opinions towards suicidality amongst religious people, and not all creeds, but relating that to religion. It turns out that his religiosity variable has 600 missing variables because that was the 650 people who said, I have no religion. Right now, are they missing for level of religiosity, like on a Likert scale? They're not. They're probably, rough guess, you could say they're not very religious, right? And so that required some recoding, or it would have just dropped out of all of the analysis. Yes? Okay. So, stealing from Young, I think this is the greatest picture ever. I think the big thing to say here is these two words here, that you can overlook, but if you can always be thinking about this anytime you're doing inferential statistics. The idea of I like, Young uses the word parameter and statistic. I would prefer to use the full name population parameter and sample statistic, right? But because it turns out that parameters and statistics are thrown around a million different ways by a million different people and so forth. But when you say population parameter and sample statistic, you clearly mean something very specific. And it turns out that these two numbers are super important for understanding the purpose of what we're doing when we are conducting inferential statistics. And the big thing to remember is that we literally just can't see past here. All of this is blank. This number is the great unknown. It's like what is actually beneath our feet. We've never dug more than about 8 kilometers below us. Everything else is inference. I think the Russians got that far, right? Everything else is inference, right? And you've got to remember all population parameters are inference, virtually, except censuses and elections, pretty much. Yeah? And so a lot of the simulations, like if you go and read all the data, they assume you know this, or if you assume you know this and then you simulate multiple times, they're all assumptions behind how we can derive things like standard error and so forth. But remember, in reality, we can almost never see this side, except very artificial circumstances. Okay, so the population parameter, it's the number we never know. It's the measure of the mean. The population parameter is not always just something like the mean, but it can also be the standard deviation. Like almost any statistic, I've used that word, but any calculation you can do on a set of numbers that can be used to describe a population distribution can be thought of as a population parameter. The sample is the mini world we can really see and touch. And within that, we calculate a sample statistic. I maybe use this room as an indicator of all Macquarie University students, and therefore from you I can deduce about how much coffee everyone drinks. And yeah, I mean, they're very simple concepts. The point is that they end up being very important as we move up the scale here and go through the various layers of concepts. So at this point, we're starting to depart from, there is some of this can be done with univariate statistics, but I want you to start thinking in bivariate terms right now. So bivariate meaning two variables. Almost all hypothesis testing in real social science or most sciences is not about one variable. It is about the relationship between two variables. Why? Because ultimately we're interested in causality. We can never get there, but we can get closer to it. And given that, it turns out that our research hypothesis, that we have these two, most research hypotheses are basically A causes B, or A causes B to go, A goes up, B goes down. Something very straightforward like that, and if you look at almost any academic article, you can often see that within the abstract. Now, we have a problem that we are all very biased towards seeing correlations in the real world. We know that, I was looking it up over the weekend, we have people who can read tea leaves, we have people who can read palms. I don't apologize if I'm offending anyone by calling palm reading mystical. You know, people can see faces in clouds as well, right? This is because human beings see patterns when they're not even there. Our brains are hardwired for it, right? And at the same time, we often have various reasons and interests why we want particular hypotheses to be true. And so what science in a sense has set up, in particular within statistics, is this idea that you're sort of responsible for playing what they call in the papacy the devil's advocate. Right? The devil's advocate, do anyone know what the devil's advocate is? That's right, but it has a real historical origin. The real historical origin is when the papacy, the Catholic Church, is beatifying, i.e. making a saint out of a human being, there is apparently this process that goes on, sort of like a court or something, where the testimony, and they have to have been proved to have done miracles, right? Which again, I'm not saying I don't believe, well I am, but I'm just not being, but I'm just saying that, anyway, I'll shut up, sorry. I'm not good at this stand-up comedy today. The point is, when the papacy beatifies a saint, there is clearly a lot of people within the church, for various reasons, who are arguing for that beatification, right? For them to become a saint. Presumably the Pope has decided this is probably a good idea, etc. But to make sure their reasoning is correct, they appoint someone to be the devil's advocate, someone to actually make all the arguments why this shouldn't happen. And in a sense, it's sort of like it's appointing the contrarian, but actually to make sure you make good decisions, right? And also to relieve that person of some of the burden of, or anyone who wants to make the argument, some of the burden of going against the Pope or the high cardinals and so forth. And in some ways, I want to say that the null hypothesis is sort of our scientific version of that. It's a very simple statement. It said that let's assume everything you've assumed is correct, except, and all your data and so forth, but there's actually nothing happening in that key relationship you're interested in, right? And that is the null hypothesis. And in a sense, we try to work out, another way to put the null hypothesis is to say, could we have got this by chance, right? Could those tea leaves at the bottom of the cup appeared there like by chance? Chances are they could, I would argue, right? But hopefully when you're doing analysis of data and we're doing social science and we find really significant results, we're showing that the tea leaves couldn't have landed there by chance, right? So and I guess it's often quite good practice. One of the other ways I would put this is that, for 10 years I was teaching in Singapore, and it was really interesting to see, because I basically had about 100 to 150 students a year who were divided into groups of about 5, so about 20 to 30 groups that would, or even more, up to 200. Up to 40 groups, and they would do mini research projects, right? They would actually go out and collect data, analyze the data, come back, and so forth. And there are a few different things that were quite remarkable about that process, but the main one was that if they were doing quantitative tests and they would have to come up with a null hypothesis, two things. They found it very hard to even think of their null hypothesis. Almost all of us, when we think of evidence, we think, what is evidence for my thing? I'm not saying what evidence would contradict what I think. It's actually a hard way to actually think about your own problem. And the second one was very funny, which was that about 80% of them didn't find what they expected, right? Which I think is one of the humbling and, rather ego-trashing things about science. This is why so many people, when they do their PhDs or honours theses or master's theses, go through at some point an existential crisis because we don't actually know that much about the world, and even the things I'm pretty sure we're certain of, we turn out to be wrong about. As an interesting aside, and I am a qualitative researcher, so I'm not saying this to trash it, but I'm more just saying this to point it out. And this is only my own opinion, and a very small sample, but students would do quality. Some of them would, for some years, I let them do either qualitative or quantitative research. And it was quite funny. 80% of the quantitative researchers didn't find what they expected, but almost every single qualitative group found what they expected to find. Right? It was very, not all, but much, much higher, you know? And that points me to the power of this null hypothesis. I just say I publish around qualitative research. I'm not taking a side on this, but I am saying that this test is, even though it's actually very simple, it's quite brutal. Yeah? Yep. Comments or questions? Is this pace all right? Move on a little bit more faster. All right, so there's examples here. I think are there any, what questions do you have at this stage?
The null is always
That's right, that there's nothing happening, or we would have got this by chance. It can be, but it rarely is. So the null hypothesis can, stand to be whatever you want it to be, but generally speaking, because we're trying to prove semi-causal relations and correlations in this world and patterns, the null hypothesis is that there is no pattern. There are other circumstances where you would. So, for example, you might say, everyone says there's a correlation between injections and autism, what's it called? Vaccinations and autism, right? You may want to prove that that's wrong. So your null hypothesis there would be that there is a relationship. And so in those circumstances, it does reverse. The null hypothesis reverses. And this is where you move into a slightly different debate, which we don't tend to get into, but it's about power. So it turns out that if you collect a really small set, you sort of know this one, as I pointed out, you collect a really small sample set, nothing is going to be significant. So if you collect a really small sample set of, say, 200 people and look at the relationship between autism and vaccinations, you're going to find nothing significant. But no one is going to say that is a very good test of your theory that there's no relationship, right? So what you actually need to do is collect a really big data set that gives you a chance to find even very small needles in haystacks. And then you can once you've collected a very big data set, you can say there truly is no relationship. Yeah. But almost always it is just that there's nothing happening. Okay. Now we get to the bit that I think people get a little bit tripped up on. This table. So, explain what we're trying to do at this point, right? When we get a sample, actually don't look at the board, just look at me. Look at me. I feel like Kath and Kim. We have one sample, but we want to say something about the world, right? And it turns out that the thing we want to say about the world is to make an estimate of that population parameter, right? From our sample, we know a few bits of information, right? From our sample, we can work out a mean, a point estimate of the population parameter, fine. We have some level of variance within our data, right? So that, not everyone here drinks the same amount of coffee, right? And then we also have another bit of information, which is the sample size. So I've got a sample size of 10. It's a crap sample. We cannot infer very much from this, right? But basically, with those 3 bits of data, the variation within our sample, the mean of our sample, or whatever population parameter we're measuring, and the size of our sample, we want to, and I'm going to tell you we can, so long as a whole lot of other assumptions are assumed, hold, we can actually draw inference about the population parameter, right, of what that is. And the reason we can do that is because basically what we know is that two of those things, all three of those numbers, right, the mean of our sample, the variation within our sample, and the size of our sample tells us how accurate that mean really is, or whatever. So let's say it's a mean, right? But that sample statistic is to the population parameter. And the reason we know that is because of this experiment here, which is always taught, but I think it needs to be taught. I'm trying to teach it, I think, backwards, but I think the right way, right? We've got three numbers. How do we know that they tell us about, what's hundreds of kilometers below our feet that we'll never ever see? And the reason we do is because we know that when we run simulations, if we pretend we could have repeated that sampling process, if I could have taken 10 people and repeated that 1,000 times across Macquarie University, let's say you're a random sample, and then I repeat it with 20 people, then 50, then 1,000 people, 1,000 times, I have all these different samples. We know that because of this experiment, which I'll explain, that basically, as our sample size gets bigger, that point estimate is very accurate. So I may be doing the classic example of this. If you're doing a survey of like 25 million Australians, it turns out after about 2,000 people, your estimates just don't get that much better. it's because the way the numbers work, right? But up to that point, between 500, up to 500, 2,000, you start to get some really pretty accurate numbers. And so the bigger the sample, the more accurate is that point estimate. The other one is that the less variation there is around that standard deviation, less variation there is in the data set, the more clear, like both within your sample, and actually the variation in your sample looks a lot like that in the population. We basically assume that. The more varied that is, the less accurate our estimate's going to be, but the more narrow that is, that estimate, so if you all drink between 1.5 and 2.5 cups of coffee a day, we can be pretty sure that the population parameter for Macquarie University is somewhere between, in that bounds there, right? But if we go from 0 to 20 cups of coffee a day, we're not going to trust that. Am I making sense? So going back to this classic thing, which I remember I was explained it like 20 years ago and I just didn't get it. I was like, why are we doing the sampling mean and the mean and this, I was like, I remember being not really getting what this was all about. But what this is all about is basically, if you only have a little bit of information, how much can you infer? Right? And it turns out that we can repeat this experiment. A few things happen as we repeat this experiment, which I think I've got in the next couple of slides. So does everyone understand what's going on here? Do you want me to just walk you through it? So this is 100 people, and this is how many hours of sleep they get per week. This is our population, which we know, but we want to pretend we didn't know, and we want to try and estimate it, right? And then what we go and do is we sample 5 people, yeah? So each of these, that's one person. We sample 5 people, we calculate the sample mean, and we dump it onto this table here. In this case, it's 42, so it'll go about there. Boom. And then we just repeat this process. A few magical, some things that are honestly, there are a few things in statistics and maths and social science that are magic. One of them is random sampling. Another one is randomizing the application to control. The third one I think that's pretty magical is the fact that the sampling distribution is normally distributed. because what happens is, as you repeat this, it doesn't matter what the shape of this is, this comes out as a beautiful bell curve. Remarkable, right? Comes out as a bell curve, and as you do this more and more and more, this shape of this bell curve can be almost perfectly mathematically approximated, especially when you do it to enough size. Yeah? And when we look here, what we have is not a replication of this. What we have is a replication of how the means that we were getting vary, right? So how much our point estimates. So, I say I look at this room and I say I've calculated the mean for this room is 2.5, but this tells me how much that 2.5 varies. And it turns out it varies with, what do we already say, the sample size. So how many people at sample varies with that, and it varies with the variation within the sample. So whether you're all between 1.5 and 2.5 copies, or whether you're between 1 and 50 copies, it's getting bigger. Right? Yes? Good. So, this is what I just explained. The central limit theorem. I always think the central limit theorem basically says if you roll a die enough times, you always get 3.5, which I think is hilarious because it's clearly you never get 3.5, but you actually always do get an average of 3.5 if you roll a dice enough times. And that's what the central limit theorem is about. Yes? I broke it down as my own sort of way of expressing it. 3 things, right? As the number of random samples of size n of a population approaches infinity, so this is the number of samples, so as we keep doing that loop over and over and over again, the mean of that distribution approaches the mean of the population. Right? So the mean of that sampling distribution is basically the mean of the population. Fine, that's not really real. Yes?
I just want to ask, when is that we use the central limit theorem? When exactly we use it?
It underlies all of this. So what happens is, it's a really good question. What it does is this is the proof that the rest of the maths works. And the main one, okay, actually let's jump to the way we use all this. Honestly, all we do as social scientists when we look at any table, we see point estimate, standard error, p-value, right? So we say for everything, right? Every single thing we look at, it's literally, there's only 3 numbers. There's a point estimate, like a coefficient, like a correlation, and whatever, a beta value, an odds ratio, whatever. Then there will be a standard error for that thing, and then there will be a p-value. Turns out that the p-value and the standard error are redundant. You only need one of them. But it's good to have 2 because you can double check them, right? Because the null hypothesis is always, almost always, except in your case, for vaccination, the null hypothesis is always that the coefficient in a bivariate or multivariate analysis is 0. Right? So, yep, you following me? So there is no relationship between A and B. Are you following? Sorry if I lost anyone. I don't want to lose anyone at this point. Have I got everyone? Have I got everyone? Have I got everyone? Yes, yes. I got you? No. I lost you. Good. I'm just going to, I lost you? Yes. Okay. I'll come back. No, it's okay. It's good. It's good. Good. You're probably the only honest one here, so that's okay. I'll come back to it, right? So when we are doing any statistical analysis, and I'm jumping forward here a little bit, but I just want to. We are generally talking about, almost all of them where we're talking about bivariate relationships, like between, say, someone give me an interesting statistical relationship. Between coffee and sleep, right? Yeah? And we know what's the correlation between it? Just using your brain estimators. We don't need to do mathematical estimators. Using your brain everyday experience estimators and the data set. More coffee, less sleep, and less sleep, more coffee. It works both ways, right? Now, if we're looking at that relationship, we will summarize that, and there's a lot of different ways we could summarize it. We could summarize it as an R value, like a coefficient, correlation coefficient. We could summarize it, which in this case it would be negative, right? Or we could put it into a linear regression and we say, how many hours of sleep, how does more hours of sleep relate to number of coffees you have? So the outcome is coffee, and say let's pretend it's that direction. Outcome is coffee and hours of sleep. Actually, let's do it the other way. It's going to be easier though. How many hours sleep do you get after how many versus how many coffees, right? And maybe for every coffee you have, you want 1 hour less sleep, right? So the coefficient for that is a -1. Yes? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you've got it. So -1. Now, the null hypothesis in that case is what? What's the null hypothesis in that model? So the coefficient for coffee on sleep would be 0. Right? Cool. So we go and do the maths, and we're social scientists, we don't understand it, we just plug it into SPSS, it comes out, and it comes out, and we get a number, and the coefficient is -1. Right, so every coffee you have, 1 hour less sleep. Right? Cool. That actually can be done very simply. The difficult bit is to know, but is that -1 really mean anything? Maybe maybe there's so much variation within the data that it's not significant. And in that case, what you need to do is calculate the standard error. Or what we want to do at that stage is, maybe we should take a break. It's about an hour. Do you want to take a break? Yeah, well, I feel like we should be nice. Let's take a 10-minute break, max. Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break. So by 17 past. Good. We'll stop in that coffee analogy. Is this useful? Some of you already know it. I know. Do you understand all this already? But it's fine. It's nice revision. But it's for the others. Is it useful?
Yeah, we can impact this last semester.
We're just taking a break. Yeah. If you. Oh, yes, of course I can.
So I know to do time series. I've done
Yeah.
section before, but it's
What I'll do is I'll make a page on here. They're pretty good though. I was slightly overwhelmed when I was reading through. I'm like, but it's. I've got to say, he does it very well. Like in the sense that there's I mean, I'm not pissing in his pocket. I'm not flattering him. There's two things that he does really well as I went through. I was intimidated. Like, one is there's really realistic examples. So we'll start with like some government posters that use univariate statistics. And it's like, oh yeah, we use that every day, right? And the other one is that it's actually, even though they're long, I mean not even that long, but there's not that much text on each slide. Like I think they've got to be the least amount of text on slides that I've seen in a statistician's. I agree. I'm pretty impressed. Yeah. Well, does he just stand there and talk, or what? No comment. I mean, yeah. Yeah, given that he only had that period of time. This one, we're going to do a lot more. I think next week we will just do it. We're going to move on to more computer labs. These couple of first few weeks are sort of setup and conceptual, but we're going to, I promise we're going to do lots of. Is that what you want? Yes. We're going to learn how to make lots of superpower.
Actually, yeah, because it's good to have the hardcore and start to do something.
That's right, exactly. Okay, so I'll get the slides up there. When did you, Emma, when did you do it last semester?
Last year.
Last year. Who did it last semester? Last semester. What do people do on the weekend? Huh? Half your weekend was under 6. You train.
Well, my husband was away, so I had to take him to the game, and I had to take him to training. So yeah, that goes Saturday morning and Sunday afternoon.
My sister's very happy they finished soccer last week. Okay.
It was really cold.
No.
Yeah, but like, it's my choice. Like, go to all professional games. Yeah.
Was this? Is this when you were on exchange? Or?
I just lived there for 2 years. Yeah.
Oh wow, nice. Was it exciting?
Yeah, it was like crazy. Like ultras, like the like the hooligans kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then Red Star Belgrade has some pretty crazy ones. So every match there'll be like flares, fireworks, everything. Yeah, they don't have any rules about it. Yeah, every game, every local game, the only time it was UEFA match because UEFA would
Yeah.
like close stadium and all that stuff.
Yeah, just you can't play in Serbia anymore.
Sure, yeah, but they'll just have like empty stadiums, so like but any local league administered match, it's like especially if it's Derby or something.
Right. And then trashing property and stuff.
Oh, it has happened, but like
Normally it's what?
Like one time it was like like it's been the Derby with Partizan, like then it was like they'll rip up the seats, like
At each other.
No, like so one time, one time the most crazy thing that happened when I was at one time it was like with Partizan Stadium, and it was Derby and Red Star, and someone hired and go into the match, pretend to be Partizan, and section. And so these guys are just turned into like an all-in brawl with their own fight, all the stage fighting each other. And then these people found out they pulled these 3 guys out, who were like 5 guys, who were like Croatian MMA fighters, who got hired. So like, I don't know what happened, but that was pretty weird.
Very, very different.
The sector's like contained, like.
So it's sort of like it's like the hill at the cricket or something like that. It's like it's one section where you know all the.
So if you want to avoid it, it's really easy to avoid it. Like you just go to the east or west side of the side of the stadium. Like the only way you get involved is if you somehow like want to get involved and jump over to the other side, which has happened as well.
Can we start? What's the one I'm waiting for? Isn't that interesting? The British used to have a lot of this as well. But they somehow had stopped. I don't know.
Like heavy punishments and like police surveillance and stuff, and actually enforcing laws. Like you get like bans for like 10-year bans, lifetime bans. They take your passport, and some people, if they have a record, you have to report to the police station every match day. Yeah, that's the idea. They're really like tough approach to it. So like, if I have a record for a while, like for certain amount of years, they have to go to the police station each match day, report that they were not at the game, like during the game, was on, and stuff like that. But that's in England. But
They didn't do that.
they just,
I don't know how that started. Under six soccer. What do people do on the weekend? So under six soccer. What other people do? Assignments. Referring. Oh no.
Taking the metro out to
No.
the metro gets really bad as well.
See, who says that parents don't have lives?
Really fast. It's
That's what I've heard. It accelerates incredibly fast.
Yeah, like that. Because you can kind of, it's effortless. So you can get to the
Front.
first coach, and you can see, yeah, it's very fast. And it's very cheap to take it.
You don't have to. Presumably, wouldn't even need to get out.
No, there's no point. There's nothing to see.
What is? Yeah, I mean, I remember when it started, when it opened, lots of people went, "Where is Tullawong? Is it Tullawong?
Yeah.
How do you say it?" Yeah.
It's past
it's like
Bella Vista. Yeah, you get out of the
playing grass field.
Good. I'm glad. We had the conversation last week about how it's ruining Macquarie equipment. Apparently, that like in the psychology lab over in Australian Hearing Hub, they've got one of these like brain scanners, and it doesn't work anymore during the metro operating hours because basically it's the electromagnetic. It wasn't a problem with the previous subway. Okay, I'm going to declare we start because we're going to run out of time. So, let me. I'm going to just try and summarize this really, really simply because I was telling you that the coffee, right? You get an estimate of, say, a regression, or you have a regression coefficient of -1, right? But how do you know whether that is really significant or not? Well, you could kind of think about, like we do here, a distribution of possible coefficients, like that -1 comes somewhere from in here, right? And what you want to know is, living out the edges of it, between these 2 points, is 0 there? Right? Is the null hypothesis there? Are you following me? So if I repeated this 1,000 times, okay, I'll give you another one.
So horizontal axis would be like 0.
So this
minus 1
the,
out of 0.
this axis here is just counts.
That's how many coffee.
So this is how many coffees. This is like this is the relationship between hours and coffee in this case. So this is say we got -1. -1, 0 plus a half. If coffees, you sleep more over here. Right? Coffees, you sleep less down here. But you can think that the estimate we got comes from a distribution like this. Yeah, I don't want to screw this up, and I think I might be screwing it up a little bit. All I'll say is this, this is what I'll say to you. This distribution, because you're asking, why do we care about all this? Because that central limit theorem allows us to get graphs like this, right? A normal distribution. And this allows us to calculate the standard error, right? Which is basically a measure of the variance of this distribution. And it turns out that is a magical number, 2. It's actually 1.96, but it's 2. Basically, right? It's 1.96 standard errors from a mean is the 95% confidence interval for an two-tailed distribution, right? And so what you do is you literally, as a social scientist, you look at other people's tables, and if you've got the standard error and the parameter, you just divide the parameter by the standard error, and you're basically saying, is that parameter more than 2 standard errors from 0? It's going to be significant. And that's pretty much all of the inferential statistics. You have those 2 numbers, and it turns out the p-value is just a different way of saying them. Standard error. Standard error. Standard error, yes. No. But it's the same thing. The standard error is the deviation of this graph, right? But the thing is that the standard error gets narrower as you have bigger sample sizes. Right, so I'll give an example. In an Aussie data set, the standard deviation of age is about 20 years. Right? Which means that everyone, I think the median is 45. So mean is 45. So almost 95% of people are within 2 standard deviations either side of the standard deviation, right? Of that, which is what's 2 standard deviations? 20, 45 minus 45, 45 plus 40, 85. 95% of people are between 5 and 85. Considering people can't do it below 18, but whatever. That's but it's a sample of about 2,000 or 4,000 people if that was a data set. And within that was a data set, because it's such a big sample, the standard error of that estimate is about 2 years, or maybe half a year. Because you've got such a big sample, the population looks like this, but the estimate looks like very narrow. And so you know that the average Australian age is between 46 and 47 or something, or 46 and 44 or something. Does that make sense? We all good? No? It's all right. Read more. We'll talk later. All right. So, are you following or not? No, did you get that or not? You did get that, right? So the central limit theorem just allows us to calculate the standard error. Basically, the central limit theorem allows us to know that the maths we do for the standard error works. Basically, for lots of different statistics. And the standard error allows us to know how accurate our estimate is and what range it's going to fall within. And it turns out that the number standard error, the p-value, and the confidence interval are all just different ways of saying the same thing. Yeah? They're literally just like different ways of saying exactly the same thing, right? Which is expressing the variation. You just express it with different numbers, but all of them are very closely related to one another and can be derived from each other, basically. Okay, so the standard error. If I repeated this survey 1,000 times, the answer would vary this much. Hands up, holds up hands, hope predicting to have caught a big fish. The point is that if we look at this, this is the same data set. This is the population Young has stimulated, 40,000 people. This is a sample from that where the sample size is 10, the size of this room. This is one where the sample size is 100. This is where the sample size is 50. And the point of this one is simply that even though they're from the same distribution, as your sample size gets bigger, your accuracy of your estimate of the population parameter gets really close, really narrow. Really, really narrow. Yep. Are we following? Are we following? Jack? This one you can get, right? No? Does it make some sense?
The purpose of this one is to get the population.
So this one I told you was population mean, and it turns out our population mean, when we repeat the survey 100 or 1,000 times or whatever, it doesn't have a number. You know, it will almost always be very close to the mean. Yeah. So the bigger the sample, the more accurate it gets. And as also it turns out that, what's this one? It turns out that sort of more obviously that if this is a narrower distribution, this is a narrower distribution. So these are the same means, but this is a very narrow range of GPAs and the same samples. So that just says if there's very little variation in the population, there's going to be very little variation in the sample means. There are two different ways that the standard error can become small. Okay, so that's standard error. Standard error, basically, if I was able to repeat this and the data from the data in my sample, what would I probably get? Or how likely would I be to get the what would be the variation in my estimates? Another way to express that is a confidence interval. So rather than saying the standard error of this point estimate is, say, 0.7, we can say the range of my point estimate is from -5 to plus, or say coffee, right? From 0.5 to +4, something like that. 0.5 to +4 coffees. And we can say that with a 95% confidence interval or a 99% confidence interval. The bigger the confidence, the stronger that, the higher the confidence, the actual wider the boundaries, because we basically, we've got less chance of being wrong by taking in more. It turns out the 95% confidence interval can be reduced to that simple equation which I was talking about before. The sample statistic plus or minus basically 2 times the standard error. Right, so 4 standard errors to either side of the sample mean or whatever sample statistic. That is where you expect the population parameter to be 95%. That's why is the 95% so important? Because how do we express 95% confidence in p-values? Yeah, less than 0.05, right? And it's slightly different, but it's broadly the same concept. And we can actually do different confidence intervals of whatever size and just substitute in for that number based on some very standard statistical tables. So the p-value is literally another way of expressing exactly the same concepts as confidence interval and standard error. Same underlying concept. In this case, the p-value is the probability just like to say the p-value is the probability you're wrong. The p-value is the probability the null hypothesis is correct. That's what the p-value is, right? So the p-value, and so we want a really small p-value. Why? Because we want a really small chance that the null hypothesis is correct. It turns out that the way we work this out is we literally just look up a test statistic on one of those tables Young has shown you before, which R does in its internal brain. And that test statistic, because almost always the null hypothesis is 0, that nothing is happening, it's simply the test statistic is the sample statistic divided by the standard error. So if we have that -1, so for every for every coffee we get 1 hour less sleep, and say it had a standard error of 0.25, so a quarter, right? A quarter of an hour, 15 minutes. Then we could say the sample statistic of -1, but actually it doesn't matter in this case because it's 1, divided by the standard error of 0.25 is 1 divided by 0.25 is 4, right? So our test statistic is 4, right? Now, we know that 2 is the magic number. Anything bigger than 2, we start to be in miracle territory. So that's huge, right? It's a highly significant effect. We have 2 main examples of test statistics, the Z and the T. T is for very small samples, less than 81. Z is broadly for everything else that we assume a normal distribution. And you can look at some of these numbers. The main point is that as Z gets much bigger than 2, very quickly it starts to be p-value that's really, really tiny. Like look at that, 0.23, just another 0.3 of a Z score. Turns out that it's very unlikely to happen. That's more just noticing the nature of the number, but these are some very key statistics and p-values that relate to them. What questions do you have at this stage? Because we're going to move on from significance. These are all different significance tests or ways of expressing significance and expressing confidence. How we go? How's everyone? No one's asleep. How you going, Paul? All right. What questions do you have? Okay. So, the thing is that things can be significant and not matter hardly at all. Particularly once you get really big sample sizes. So you can see that the standard error starts to drop precipitously as you get bigger and bigger sample sizes, right? And that would mean that more and more stuff starts to become significant, even if it's a very small effect. We end up asking a couple of other questions. When you look at, so this is again looking at maths like a social scientist, or looking at statistics like a social scientist. We look at the coefficients we get with whatever test it is, and we ask these 3 things. The first thing we ask is it significant? The reason we ask is it significant is because if it's not significant, we can ignore the rest. Right? If it's not significant, it's not significantly different from 0, can assume it's 0, move on, get on with your life, right? Number 2, you look at, before you even interpret the number, you look at the direction. Is it a plus or a minus? And sometimes in some statistics, a plus and a minus are different, like in an odds ratio, in a logistic regression, the equivalent of the null hypothesis is 1. So below 1 is a negative and above 1 is a positive relationship. I'm just saying that, but broadly speaking, positive and negative relationships are expressed how you would expect, right? A correlation negative, one goes up, the other goes down. Second thing to look at, and it's very important, just two tips with both of these. When you're looking in R and you're looking at significance tests, just because it says p-value or significance doesn't mean you're looking at the right p-value. So for example, often when you're presented a regression model, it'll have a p-value for the model, but actually we're not interested in that. We're interested in a p-value for each of the parameters. So make sure you're looking at the right p-value. Yeah? The second one is with direction. Direction again sounds simple, except that things can be reverse coded. Right? So let's say someone multiplied all of our coffees by -1, or hours of sleep was measured in hours less than 8 hours, or something, I don't know. You know, there's lots of ways, and you'll see it in your data sets more than it just happens so much, and it's so painful that things are coded in the opposite directions. People code strongly agree to strongly disagree with a negative statement from 1 to 5, right? And it's just, your brain falls out when you're trying to figure it out. So direction seems straightforward, but it isn't unless you've really done all the setup correctly. Good? But this is where we're getting to today. The last one you want to know is how significant is the relationship. So while I have a quote. Oh yeah, at the top here. Significance says, does it exist? Ask, does it exist? Effect says, does it really matter? Right? Or strength says, does it really matter? And one of the things to note, I think, and this is more something for us to look into, and I want you to ask me as we go through every week from now on, is where do I get an idea of effect size? How do I measure effect size in this? Right? Because it turns out that each test and each thing we look at has got slightly different measures, and there are better and worse ways of getting an estimate of it. So I've given just some examples here that you will have come across or will come across. So you've seen correlation coefficients. You saw it in the first week's lecture. The rule of thumb, Young is a bit more Bolshevik about this. He says he says small stops at 0.3, and I think large starts at 0.6 or something. But whatever, we can broadly think something like that is whether they're small, medium, or large. It's weird, but actually there's a whole literature on effect size, and they talk about it in terms of the differences in height between a 15-year-old girl and a 16-year-old girl, or a 12-year-old girl and a 14. And it's like quite funny, but they usually say one is small, one is medium, one is large in terms of the height, right? Because it's what you can actually see or not see on average. But we can actually, this one is a bit weird, but it turns out and a bit hard to get an intuition of. But if we square it, we start to really get a very clear idea. Because an R squared, which is literally the square of that number, but it can be calculated in another ways, is the proportion of the dependent variable that's at maximum potentially explainable by the independent variable. Yes. No, that's the Pearson's R. You square it, you get that. So, and I just want you to do some squaring. So let's square 0.5. What's the square of 0.5? 0.25, which means what percentage of variation is explained by the independent variable and dependent variable. If your R squared is 0.25. 25%. Does 25% seem like a lot or a little thing? It's decent, right? It's decent, yeah. It's often, if you get statistics like that when you actually do your thesis or whatever, reflect your own data, you'll be incredibly happy and impressed. But if we go down here, look at this. So let's go down to 0.3. What's the square of 0.3? That's an R squared. What's the R squared percentage? 0.3? 3 3 is a 9. We've got a point, so we're going to add another 0 in there. 9%. Right? Oh, it's not looking so significant now. So 0.3 seems pretty impressive, right? Like, you know, got a correlation of 0.3, you'll be very happy, right? 9%. 0.2. Multiply that out. 4%. 0.1, 1%. Right? So you can get a significant result with 0.1. That's probably all you'll find in many of your data sets. right? But it explains 1% of the variation in the dependent variable, right? And that becomes, I think that is I really like, I mean, when someone explained that to me, I'm like, why didn't they just like explain to that when we were in year 7 or something? It's a really good way about thinking about relationships. How much of the outcome can I understand? And if you actually looked at these as scatter plots, you would see, you can wiki it, look at it on Wikipedia. These look like just messes. These look like nothing's happening. Actually, they really do look like nothing's happening. And that's because there's a huge amount of noise. There are other ways you can do it with bivariate statistics, so you can think about just the maximum percentage change in the dependent variable caused by a unit change. There's some slides that Young's done on that. What questions do you have about this before I move on? Are we getting it? Are you following what I'm saying here? Yes? Jack? All right. And so, last point, regression. So, in regression, there's 3 numbers that you really want to pay attention to for effect size. They're very useful, and you can look at them in the cases we're going to look at in a second. Standardized beta is this. I remember when I first learned this, why are we learning standardized beta? Now I love standardized beta. I like to calculate it for everything because, like Milena was saying, for last semester she made a dependent variable that was an index of like a bazillion different numbers, ordinal, blah, blah, blah. Young said it was fine, chuck it all together. But then she looks at the coefficient and he says, what does 2.3 mean, you know, in my random index? Right? And it's true. Many of the times we measure things in units that don't make a lot of sense. Right? And it's like, is that big or not? Well, standardized beta is one of the ways to say, is that big or not? And what it does is it says, if you have a 1 standard deviation movement in your independent variable, so say coffee drinking is like varies, has 1 standard deviation of say 1 coffee, how many standard deviations of sleep does that move it? So let's say people get on average 7 hours sleep, plus or minus 2 hours, so again the standard deviation is about 1. Then, you know, if we measured them in equivalent, we measured them in comparable measures, we would say how much does 1 unit of coffee affect in how many 1 units of sleep? Now that doesn't make any sense, it's kind of, because I've already reduced it to 1s, but we thought of something more. Anyway, are you getting my point or not really? You are, I think. The point is that it shows you, say you're measuring 1 unit standard deviation in age impacting on dollars of income, right? And you could say, instead of measuring income and age in years and dollars, you actually measure them in standard deviations. And it ends up being, it means that basically what it means is that you reduce everything to the same units, right? And then actually this looks a hell of a lot like a correlation coefficient, actually, in practice. The other 2 big ones are an R-squared and a change in R-squared. And what you'll find for almost all regression models is there's some version of an R-squared, which is, like, there's enough literature to say it's probably not that very good and they vary a lot, but there's still a good rough estimate of how much the independent variables in your model explain of the outcome. Right? So similarly to how we could say here, 1 independent variable explains 7 out of the independent variable, we can now say, when I put these 20 independent variable in, how much of the outcome can I explain? The last one, which is probably the most significant of all of them in terms of, because what tends to happen is that when we're asking effect size, we don't ask what is the effect of coffee on sleep. We want to say what is the effect of coffee on sleep, controlling for a whole lot of other factors. Like how much sleep do you normally get, how much, you know, what determines sleep? How much exercise do you do each day, how depressed or happy you are, etc., etc., whatever it is that drives it. Employment status. That's all right. How stressed are you at work? How stressed are you in relationships? Whatever it is. But the point is you want to control for lots of other factors, right? Because those factors could be co-varying with the other ones. They're caused by coffee, or they cause coffee drinking, and they cause lack of sleep. So we've got to control for all those things. So the change in the R squared ends up being a really powerful measure of effect size. What you do is you run the model without, you'll say, coffee in it, and then you run the model with coffee in it. And as the model goes from, say, an R squared of 20% to an R squared of 25%, you go, coffee explains 5% of sleeping. Awesome. And you're happy, right? And that is one of the reasons why when you actually see in regression, so you see like all the papers you've got, people have run like 6 regressions or something, like 4 or 5, 6 regressions. One of the big things is they drop out and put back in different variables, and you watch the R squared along the bottom, right? That tells you how much significance it is. The thing is, and if you ever do a thesis, many people have published with effective R squareds of around 1 or 2%. So don't get stressed. It's amazing how little we know about the world, and you're not the only one, right? We just don't know how the world works. I think R squared can make people very impressed. When you actually realize how little of the world your model explains. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. I didn't want to go for nearly that long, but I hope it has been useful. Has it been? Questions, comments? Yes.
Is that related to sample size?
No, it's not actually. It's independent of your sample size. I mean, you get better measures of it if you have a better sample size. Sorry, that time.
I was going to say, well, I've done my regression and I've found 1 or 2% variation.
No, it's not. It's more. It's actually. It's the accuracy is dependent on the size of your sample and the quality of your sample and all those sorts of things. But the R squared's not. The R squared's driven by things like what's in your model and what the real underlying relationship is. Yes.
What is one after like 0.08?
8%. So that means your model is explaining 8%.
Yeah, way higher than.
That's the whole model. I was saying that's the variation. So when you add in, so if you look at, I wish I could pull this up, but if you add in Protestantism, do you want to see it on his? Do you want to see an example of it on his? Actually, can I plug yours in? Nice example. I have one that's compatible actually. Do is we just plug. This is going to go in here. This can go in here. Oh. Okay, so here we have, and this is a beautiful example. OLS regression, suicide acceptability on stress, religious affiliation, religious attributes, interaction shown, controls shown at the bottom. And it goes over to the next page, which is a little annoying, that's what the numbers are we want, but I think we did. Are you following? Yep. OLS, when you see OLS, that stands for ordinary least squares, which means it's a linear regression. regression rather than a logistic regression. And the ordinary least squares is the method of find the thing. It's a bit funny, but it's a classic thing that people say. The suicidality, how is it measured?
Three questions.
How many points? 5-point scale?
1 to 5.
And then add it together?
And
Average?
together and you have to allow, yeah.
And average. Okay, all right. So this is on a 1 to 5 scale. How much does stress level that's measured on increase your acceptance of suicide? Turns out it's very significant. Look at it here, right? So just to say, remember they said we look at these things and what do we do? We sort of last week to 5. And look what it's here when it's 2. So 0.58 divided by 0.32. That's about 15 divided by 3 is like 5. The Z statistic for that is huge. Right? Can you see that? Yes, Z score is huge. And so it's highly significant. You go way below 0.1. Those 3 stars in. Yes, 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 yes. Okay. We'll go over here and we go Buddhism. Right. 0.67 divided by 0.457. It's less than 2, right? And there are no stars. So this person's it's consistent, right? I mean, you're just double checking, but that's pretty much what expertise is. It's double checking everything. Again, there's a big difference. It's about 0.5 to 6, Z score of 6, but here they're almost the same value and it's not significant. So that tells you that Protestantism has a negative effect on suicidal acceptability, right? I think this is a dummy variable, 1 or 0, and so 1 unit of Protestantism lowers suicide acceptability on a 5-point scale by about 0.3. Fine. Then you can go along here and you can see religious attendance and religious salience have the same effects. And stress and attendance, so stress and your attendance, actually the negative effect again. So the stressed religious, stressed religious people are anti-suicide as well.
Yeah.
It's protective, I guess. Yeah. And same here, stress and salience. Okay, fine. And now here we have what do we call these ones? Control variables, right? Now, I guess our question is, how much does stress explain with all the controls of suicide acceptance? And then how much is it added to by just looking at this particular one? And then we can go all the way up until we add every other variable in, right? And we're just going to look at the R squared, correct? So, so this is the first model. R squared. Well, 4%. 0.038, right? That's fine. Really good job, I'm sure. As we add in Protestantism, it goes up by about 7%, so about 3.3%. Whatever the other That's right. So this is stress and controls. Protestantism, basically, controls and stress. Religious attendance. These range it a bit, but the overall explain quality of the model. Good. And I mean, one of the things that I just think is funny, this is where I think like there's a real danger. I mean, this is where I think scientists lie, to be honest. I just think it's worth. No, I'm not joking. I say it quite provocatively, but quite deliberately. I mean, if this person got on the radio and was famous all across Korea for this, it's explaining 3% of variance in suicide beliefs. That means that there's another 97%, or maybe like we explained a bit here, there's at least another 90% that is explainable by anybody else who's got a pretty rough guess and lived a life. So it's weird. You don't really, like, if you just drove all policies because of that, would you be making good policy? No, right? I mean, it's sure, it's a factor. It's been shown to be a factor. Probably it underestimates the factor, but also but I think the rest of the model is kind of like basically the realm of argument, ordinary people's experience to inform policy and all the rest of it. Okay, end of sermon. How are we going? The exercise that I've got for us to do. Okay, so the exercise I want us to do, which you might take about 15 minutes to do, is I need you to go to Methods 101 and then click on Google Docs here. So I will create a new page for week 3. Sorry. Why did it do that? Sorry. There we go. So what I would like you to do is to pick a bit of space. Oh, forget it. Fail. Let me try to just clean this up. What I would like you to do here is to write answers to the following, to these. So what I've got is, my suggestion is that we try and identify examples of these. I think particularly towards the bottom, around standard errors, confidence intervals, effect size, and so forth, from one of these two data sets. So in a sense, these are my two examples of data sets that I've uploaded everything for onto Methods 101, including the articles. So the article you can just get by right-clicking here and opening in a separate window. This is the McAllister one you know about. This is my PhD thesis that got published 10 years after my PhD. And it's here. Both of them have regression models, all the rest of it. In the next exercise, we're going to just experiment playing with downloading the data sets and playing with the data sets. But for now, what I want you to do is, I think maybe you can just write your name, the article, so which one you're going to, and then the concepts you're going to try and look for. So we're not all doing the same. So just write it there, and then go and spend 15 minutes trying to find examples of them. You know, and then you can either screenshot them and put them in. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Screenshot and put them in, or you can just take an example. You could just put a bullet point and explain it and say what page it's on, and then we'll come back and we'll share a little bit. No, just pick one. The idea is that there's some variety. You know, I kind of want to see, yeah, there's variety. So the articles are on the page, Methods 101, on exercise lesson 3.2, sorry. At the bottom of the page, there are 2 articles, example and article and dataset 1, an example article and dataset 2, and where it says article.pdf on both of them, you just click on that and it will take you to the articles. Good? I'll cut and paste the question. And what I want you to do, try and explain how they illustrate the concepts. So I'll just. Yeah, finding examples of them. Like, so for example, like when we just, okay, give you an example. So we just went through Jack's article and we looked at the table and we found the standard errors and the p-values, and we looked at the effect size in terms of the the R squares and so forth. Does that make sense?
It wasn't my article.
No, your article, yeah.
It wasn't.
Jack. With the noting that not all of them are going to be there. So I don't think you're going to find any of yours, Jack, actually. Okay, shall we talk? How are people going? Do you need more time? Done? Don't know.
For factor analysis.
There's nothing. I said there's nothing in. There's not going to be anything for those.
Although,
Not quite. Okay. Should we just come back and start discussing these very briefly, and then we can move on? Who wants to share about McAllister? Several people looked at the McAllister. Which concepts do people identify? Who looked at McAllister? Yeah. What did you find? Who wants to share? That's about it. It's mainly, I mean, I don't think these questions are not that profound at some level, but there are, you know, so what you noticed, maybe I should have asked what was missing as well. But yeah. Were there or they were not there? Where's the mean? But just in the text. Hey, oh, this.
Then you have to read the text to see what that referred to, because it's not obvious, when you get to that, what that
Okay.
represents.
I realise that's what we probably should be doing here is going, what is actually missing from all of these? So your point is that, well, McAllister, no descriptive statistics, correct? Basically, or no table of descriptive statistics. What else?
What about population and sample data? Because population will be all the respondents, or the was
Population is the entire Australia.
but the ones that
The sample?
the sample is
The sample is the.
yeah, that's the sample.
Okay, where are the sample statistics on here? Yeah, I mean, that's a sample, but the sample statistics. So we've been learning all about sample statistics and population parameters, right? What's the sample statistic?
Standard parameter.
Do you know this? Quite a sample mean. These, right? Do you? Maybe I pushed this too far ahead. Do you guys do you understand this table or not? How many people feel they understand this table? One. They're actually just coefficients. So ordinary least squares regression estimates showing partial coefficients and standard errors. Partial coefficients and standard errors. Predicting the probability of possessing political knowledge measured from 0 to 10. Right, so in this, what do? They have a scatter, they ask you 10 questions, you get a point for each one you get right. Right, so let's pick a simple one. Gender, I presume one is female, that's always the way it's done. So one is female, the coefficient here is 0.7. What does that mean?
Female.
Either right.
Female has more social knowledge or something?
70%, but very close. What is this V is a measure on a linear regression. Remember, linear regression is a y equals bx plus c or whatever, right? So it's the outcome that everything adds up to the 0 to 10 scale. So 1 unit of gender moves the 0 to 10 scale how much?
0.7.
0.7. 0.7. Yeah, basically 0.7. What's 0.7? What is that? What is that? What does that mean in real life? Women get about how many questions right?
0.7.
0.7, okay. Probably quite a lot, actually. Yeah? It's quite a big effect. Age, 0.05. I don't know whether that's measured in years or it's measured in decades. Yes? Okay, well, not really. But our point here is that we're going to learn more about linear regression and logistic regression. The main thing to say here is that these are examples of sample statistics. Why are they examples of sample statistics? Because they're estimated from the sample and they attempt to represent the overall population parameters. Paul? It doesn't have to be the sample mean. So the point is that a sample statistic could be correlation coefficient, like any of these things are, and that's all right. This is exactly the sort of stuff that is worth to get at this stage, right? Which is that, yeah, a sample statistic could be many different sample statistics, right? It could be a correlation coefficient, it could be a,
What would those two?
so what, anyone want to explain what do you think it means? Standard error. Standard error. Yeah, so it says here, partial coefficient and standard errors. That stands for standard errors. So what does that mean? What does it mean?
Like the first one explains 3% of case.
No. Paul. Can we come back to that? Right? Paul, what does? I mean, this is pretty tough. Like 0.7 and 0.08.
Like these between like
Times 2. So 0.08 is basically 0.1, right? So basically 0.1 of the question. Multiply that by 2, 0.2. So we know that the estimate for a female, the true population parameter with a 95% likelihood is within 2 standard errors of that 0.7 estimate. 2 standard errors is about 0.6. So the real true parameter value for gender on those scores somewhere between 0.5 and 0.9. No? Sorry, this is a little.
Yeah, I'm confused because gender is like a binary thing. So then why is that point?
Yeah.
Like, what is that in relation to?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So imagine, sorry. Let's do this. Let's just, yeah, this is really good. Let's go. So, whiteboard marker. Y equals b1 x1 plus plus constant. Right? So we've got, but this is gender in this case, right? So x is for each person, their value of gender can either have a 0 or a 1. Yeah? 0 is male, 1 is female. And this b is what we have estimated, and it is equal to, in our case, 0.7. Right? So, controlling for all other factors, what's y here? This is your score on the 0 to 10 quiz. Yep. Following that, but this is good. Everyone's got that. Everyone understands what y is. Milena? Yep. So what this says is that what this here in a little bit. I'm just talking about this line here, right? A coefficient in a regression always means for 1 unit movement in the independent variable, how much does the dependent variable go up for, or by? So 1 unit movement is the difference between being male and female is a 1, and women get 0.7, which is almost, between, 3/4 of a question right on average more than men. Controlling for all other factors. No? It is. It's actually literally this. If this with a binary variable, that number is the difference between men and women. Controlling for everything else in that model. Controlling for everything else, age, income, Australian born, blah blah blah. Being a woman, do that. But if you're a young woman, not as well. Right, in comparison to young men. Presumably, women get better at this politics quiz with age than men. Yes, I apologise for. I'm pushing you a bit hard here. This is like what you learned in the last week of Young's, and yes. We're going to do a lot more on this later on, so you don't need to completely freak out and be expect. We're going to spend a long time on it. My main goal with you all is for you to look at this table and feel comfortable, right? And to be able to read it. Yeah, that's right. And yep.
It's the controls. I just said 1, 0.008. Say 0.1. It doesn't mean. Number on the left.
Yes.
Does it mean like from 6 to 9?
It does. So this is the estimate. This is the sample statistic. But the true population parameter is going to be between 0.7 plus or minus, what is it? 2 times. Yeah, 0.08. I did this great online. This is relevant. I know it's going to sound silly, but I promise it's relevant. I did this online astronomy, intro to astronomy course to my Princeton 10 years ago, which is like listen to the podcast. And in it, one of the best bit of advice the guy gave was, in this class, no calculators. Everything you calculate with one significant figure. Right? And the reason for that is that actually you can't really think in much more than one significant figure. So you should be doing the maths in your head in about one significant figure. Does that make sense? One significant figure means that pi, 3. Square root of 10, 3. etc., right? And so that's why, and actually, to mention that is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. just dimensional. So what we do is we're going to say 0.7, 0.1 always. Sorry, I've made a mistake. Yes, you're right. O in there and there's not there, right? So that's why, and I just say that's actually a tip in thinking. It's like saying, can I summarize this as one word? So this equals what? So what is this, the range? So that's, it's 0.16. So 7 minus 0.16 is about 0. We can do this in our head, 54, all right? 2, 0.86. So our 95% confidence interval for the effect of gender on that quiz is 0.454 to 0.86. That's how we would express it. Good?
Yep.
So that is because we go back and look at the tables, and the magic number for a p-value, for a p-value of less than, it's called 0.05, the magic number is a z-score of 1.96. And that is 2. Following the principles of that astronomer, that is 2. Yep. So 2, so that's our range. Yep. Now we can also, I said there are 3 ways that we can express that confidence interval, right? Yep. So one of them is a confidence interval. The next one is, we've already got it up there, a standard error. Right? So the standard error and the mean. So just literally just saying 0.7, and with the standard error of, with the standard error of 0.08 is another way of expressing that variation. There are 2 other ways that we can express it. Yep. Oh no! Damn, feminism burned. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for noting that. I'll put money on the fact that 1 will be female and 0 will be male in the majority of your data set, so that my assumption is not completely stupid. What's it in yours? I don't know.
It's the Korean one, I think.
Is it?
Yeah, on the Korean one.
Right. Okay, that's hilarious. I'm embarrassed, but that's great. Okay, very good. So, but what are the other 2 ways that we can measure this? I'll give you a hint. Yeah, what are the other 2 ways you can measure our confidence of the parameter value? P and Z. Right? Correct? So Z is our test statistic. So we've got method 1, confidence interval. Method 2 is just look at it. Method 3 is our test statistic, which is a grandiose way of saying, well, it's not actually, sorry, I shouldn't call this mean, I should call this coefficient, but it is kind of mean, coefficient. It is actually the mean difference between men and women. Test statistic is equal to your coefficient divided by the standard error. That's also Z in this case. So what is it in this case? So what's the Z value here? So 0.7 divided by 0.08. Anyone got a calculator? 8.75, which is basically 9. Z score of 9 is gigantic. What's Google the p-value, just type in Google p-value for a Z score of 8 or 9. Because basically, the only way to work that out is to look it up on a table, and Google will do it faster than any of us. So the p-value, which is the chance that we got this by chance. This is the chance we got this by error, by chance, and actually there was nothing going on. Can we get it? It's actually going to be a ridiculous scientific notation. No. Type in your Z score. I'm just going to go 9, two-tailed. It doesn't even calculate it for us. It's going to be absolutely tiny. P-value is very, 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 very small. We could probably do it on R very easily. But it's going to be many, 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 zeros. Yep. Good. Oh, wrong thing. I feel like I've crushed you. Yeah.
Numbers, for example.
Calculate the statistical power. That's the concept is statistical power. And there are ways to calculate it based on there are formulas you can look up. There are ways to calculate it based on how small is the thing you're looking for and how much of a chance you want to make sure that you didn't miss it. Right? And so the power is related. So Young taught you about alpha values, which is that p-value less than 0.05 or whatever it is. And there's another notion which is a beta value, which is different, completely different to standardized beta, but it is a number. It's what's the chance that you that's really there. And from that you can work out. There are lots of different calculators. Sorry to not answer your question directly. Well, I did. I gave you the concepts. Now you know what to Google. yeah. That's qualitative analysis. Yes, Jack. We haven't. We're not. We didn't get to it today, and but I can. Let me give you a. Let me just. I don't want to. Like, I want to let you guys do a little bit more hands-on stuff. Actually, maybe I will just explain it very briefly. So one of the things we're going to do later on is factor analysis. Has anyone done factor analysis before? So it turns out that this is not systematic. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. I don't want to. I won't confuse it. So, Milena, what questions do you have about this? Did you follow this or not? No. To understand that, yeah. I mean, we're not going to. Yeah, that's right. This is. I mean, this is where. This was the end point. This is what Young did cover at the end of his class. class. Like, so, you know, so zero would be the starting point, right? But I know that it's not, because actually, and if we can get you to the point where you really can't get this at the end of the class, then it'll be good. And that's why, when you notice, I haven't got you producing multivariate statistics, which is what this is, except for week 13. So you don't produce it in week 7, but in week 7, you'll have analysis of the data set. We'll have it in there and we'll be building up to that. Yep. So I don't. I saw that this afternoon and I wondered the same thing. I think it must be referring to the fact that they're controlling from each other. So sometimes you can get a table like this in a paper, not with the constant on the R squared, but a table like this, and they've used linear regression like the coefficient, so they've just put one in at a time. So to say and then the partial coefficients, to say partials for everything else in the model. That's my reading. Because otherwise, and everything else, there are not that many ways to read it. There's not that many ways to do it OLS. Yeah. So that's I would be 95% sure that's what they mean by it. So, I mean, as we just go through it, look at these other effects. So tertiary education, I think that means you've got a bachelor degree or not, or above. One end of that, you get about 0.8 higher. I don't think so. I mean, you can look at, like, it's at the back of the thing, it's got the explanation of each of them. Right. Australian born, you get about half better. Family income, I think, is divided into 5 categories. So from the lowest to the highest category might be almost 5 minus 12 is about 60, so 1.6. Urban residents do a little bit better. That's binary, though. It might actually be 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 being rural and 4 being fully urbanized. So that's this here in the equation. And this is if you set all of these to 0, some of which will be meaningless, then the constant is that people get -5 in the quiz. Right? That doesn't mean anything, but that's because things like age, setting an age to 0 doesn't mean anything. Right? Well, it means newborn, right? Yes, the constant is the intercept. The constant is the intercept. It is the intercept for a very complex, for a very long equation with many parts. Yeah. Yeah, the constant is the intercept. Exactly. X-intercept. Otherwise. Yes.
So this coefficient the same as
which coefficient table? This is your table.
Sorry, no, that's regression.
This is a regression table. This is the regression table.
The column there, they're all the coefficients.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So
there aren't, and I think that must just be. There are in the right-hand column, in the young people column. I know, but that's a good thing. See what he just did there? He said, I've said that to people, and it's true. Like it's often an indicator that you've screwed it up. Yeah. I think we're not going to do any R today. We're just going to do it very clearly. We're doing just do this. Are you guys all right? I mean, I've decided to stick with this and adopted the class a little bit, but I think just meditating on this helps us solidify one bit of knowledge, right? You had a question, Richard.
Yeah, go through this, but all correspondence that 9.5%
So yeah, well, I mean, so we haven't learnt about this, but it honestly it doesn't matter that much, except when you're writing your paper out. There's an R squared and an adjusted R squared, and with logistic regression, there's a whole lot of different pseudo R squared. This happens to be talking about what's going on in the population rather than in a sample, and takes account of the fact that as you throw more variables in here, this goes down a little bit. But for our intents and purposes, and 99.9% of the time, it's an R squared. And it says that all of these variables together, at best, could be explained 40% of the variation in the quiz scores. Yep. Well, it's more at best because there are probably a lot of third variables that are not measured. It's just more that what it is, it's saying, because this is really a measure of correlation. So it's saying that of the variation in quiz scores, 40% of it co-varies with these coefficients. Yeah.
So if you add more controls, should that score go up?
Yes, it should. But just interestingly, right, what we know as sociologists, that there are some big things that matter, there's a whole lot of stuff that doesn't, right? So once someone's put gender, political interest, age, tertiary education, nationality, family income, urban residence, you're starting to run out of ideas.
Maybe your R squared goes up as your number of variables, but the adjusted R squared is to compensate for that. So your
Yes.
won't necessarily go up as you keep adding variables. And that's why you use the adjusted R squared, not before R squared.
Thank you. Very well put. That's exactly right. No, you're exactly right. I can't say that, I'll confuse people. Sorry.
Does it stop you loading up your
It does, yeah. The adjusted R squared stops you loading it out because as you put more variables in, the R squared just gets better, but your adjusted R squared doesn't. That's what? That's shit. I noticed, right? Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things in here that they don't do. We said that if you have an independent variable that you're using to explain lots of stuff, right? You're saying, hey, I show the internet. For instance, let's say I wrote a paper that said, hey, the internet really affects young people's knowledge of politics. The test for that would be what? Not this. I mean, you would get a significance. So yeah. So its the main null hypothesis that they're testing and the research hypothesis is these, right? They want to say, do you use the internet? If you use the internet, does it increase your scores on our quiz? Right? And it turns out that yes, better internet skills, which means I can open an email and download a file, and frequency of internet use, which is like once a week, once a day, all the time, or whatever, they do increase your scores in the quiz, even after you've controlled for socioeconomic status and age and all these other things. Correct? So it's a good test per se of significance, but what is it not a good test of? Remember we said there are three things we always test for. When you look at a coefficient, you go, is it significant? Direction? And then effect size. How are we measuring effect size? That's what mainly been talking about effect size in terms of what? R squared. So there are two things they could do here. One is they could report the standardized coefficients, which we could have calculated if they'd included a mean and standard error table. Actually, we can because it's a public data set, we can still get it. But the other thing you would do is you would run one 4 respondents missing those, and 1 with them in. Right? And you would get a change in the R-squared value. And that would tell you sort of like, oh, it explains 3% of visual knowledge, if they're lucky. These are very rough questions. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, they're very rough questions.
Like the 0.4 is, even if your frequency goes up from
Yeah,
10 times it, you're only going to get an extra like 0.4 question right, and so you can push that out to the maximum frequency and go, oh, actually, we still don't increase knowledge by that much.
You might not. I mean, thinking about it in comparison, I've got to say, thinking about it in comparison to tertiary education, like getting a degree, it's pretty, like you add those two together, they're about the same as being a man or getting a degree.
Yeah.
So they're not bad. I mean, for just 1 unit, I presume the thing with all these is you've got to go down and look at the end of the table and look at is there an appendix? Oh yeah, here we go. So internet use, never to 7. So they do move a lot. Actually, we do have, hey, who didn't read the paper? There is means. Or did you say this? Someone else said this. There are means. There's no standard deviations. We don't know how much they vary by. But this is, there's a bit of room. Like 5 times 0.4 is 2 marks out of 20, out of 10. Beautiful. So it's not bad. But I don't know. Actually, so maybe it is going to be a big effect. I know this probably, Milena's like, this is not systematic. But honestly, going through and studying an academic paper like this is one of the best ways for you to really get on top of understanding what statistics is, how it's used, and so forth. I really want to say that. I know this might seem a bit haphazard, but we're all following the same train of thought. Yeah. Then this leads to what?
Like if you've got a paper, you're studying it, and you're producing that stuff.
Yeah.
Food and stuff.
Yes, Emma.
Because each variable on a different scale, then when you input the tools for each variable, are they comparable to each other, or
They're not.
different scales?
So that is where the thing called, the standardized beta, right, comes in. So they don't report it, but standardized beta or standardized coefficients makes them comparable. And that's why a lot of the time they're used. And the standardized beta would say, well, there's one standard deviation. How many standard deviations in quiz scores does one standard deviation movement in frequency of collection internet use move? So it's almost always less than 1, but it gives you actually a really decent number, which is very similar to a correlation, a correlation coefficient in terms of how you can interpret it. So yeah, that's why people use standardized betas. And it's really weird, like when you learn about standardized betas, you learn all these equations and blah, 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 blah. It's like, no. The point of this, the social scientist, is we want everything on the same freaking scale so we can tell which ones matter more than others by just looking at it. Right? And how much they matter versus other things. Yeah? And I can go tell you all the equations, but ultimately that's what it is. You want to just turn everything into the same scale. And that scale is standard deviations. Good? Okay, I feel like I should end. Can I do a quick revision? What did you learn today? you learn today? Actually, and also I don't want to know what you. I want to know what you really learned. You didn't know that before you came in. Now you feel you understand it. Oh, completely. Okay. All right. Why don't we just go around? Does everyone admit one thing that they learned today? What was the most significant thing that they learned today? Most we can call out. You can call out and you can go home. Okay. Simplest population parameter. Yep. What else?
Hard work and then. And how does that there relate to working out what the 95 complex would like mean would be?
Okay, very good. Central limit theorem. Why was that important to you? Okay. And you didn't know that before? And now you didn't get it at that one? Nothing. Reminds you already knew all of this. What did you learn? I can ask you how you go.
I guess I kind of find that I really should
Can I say your trick of using like thinking of all numbers as one figure?
Yeah, you can. I think that's the best. That's true. One significant figure for all numbers. Okay, very good. See, you knew all this already. I can
But
tell.
I've forgotten that cross-section of population, the answer of 5 is good.
Ah, yes. Right, but in time series it's not because you've got because in a time series. Yeah, okay. Black hole. Go.
Already gave you one.
Oh, did you already do one? Did you?
Yeah.
What did you do? Sample.
Yeah.
I apologize. And what you didn't understand, you still don't understand. Yeah, did you learn anything? Okay. I want you to, maybe what you can just do is, what I would love is email me your questions. Because I hate, if you want, or you can tell me your questions straight after class, I'll write them down and try and clarify them.
I also learned about how to use the R squared again. I remember it from the last semester, but I forgot kind of like which ones the pieces are, which ones the generating one. So,
Okay. I forgot my little post-it notes, but if you want to tell me what you liked or didn't like, or what you want to learn more of, do tell me privately or on email or whatever. Cool. Next week we will focus on the projects and we'll focus on R and we'll do lots of coding. If you can try to have your data sets downloaded, that would be great. If you haven't, it's fine. You can use one of the ones I've got. But I think I had a question. I will answer that now. Yes, we'll go through an answer now.
My data is set to state one.
We can import that in 2 seconds. As long as it's on your computer,
Right.
it's in 2 minutes or 30 seconds.
When do we
Get it right. Yeah, exactly. We can.
To be able to start your-
Yeah, for sure. And also, if you haven't picked your data set and you're having trouble choosing, email me, WhatsApp me, whatever. We can talk about it. I'm really happy to sort it out between now and then. Yep, good. Cool. And I think next week what I'll do is I'll put together like basically a formula of code that you can use to do these sorts of things. So, yeah. Awesome. Thank you.